بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. I thought I would do a quick little follow-up video from yesterday's session with the Mad Mamluks. Alhamdulillah, it was a delight to come back on their show. It's hard to believe it had been 4 years, but it had indeed had been 4 years. And we had a chance to talk about a number of things. Some of that was CRT, right? Critical race theory, which is now this buzzword that's everywhere. Postmodernism, postmodernity, right? Postmodernism, and of course the whole some questions around identity, LGBTQ. Anyway, a number of we talked about a bunch of things, and we only got a chance to really sort of scratch the surface. And I thought what I would do actually is I had reference to a book and an author, Paul C. Vitz, who's an academic coming out of the Catholic tradition. And as you can see, you can find his book here on Amazon or wherever else you get your books from. Anyway, it's called The Self Beyond the Postmodern Crisis. But before we going beyond the postmodern crisis, I thought what I would do is actually share a short excerpt from the book, because I believe he gives a really good breakdown in the intro. So I was laughing, right? In grad school, you learn basically just read the intros of books, and then, that's how you become really smart. So in the intro to his book here, he goes into a really good definition in a very succinct way, right? This is obviously extraordinarily this is for brevity's sake, really shortened, right? But enough to understand, because when we use these terms, postmodern or liberal or now, critical race theory, CRT, right? Well, what does it mean? So, as I had said in the interview, right, or the podcast, whatever, that when we talk about a thing, to a great degree, we're talking about the people who talk about that thing. And of course, there will be typically many different minds, many different authors, right, in that. And so that's no difference whether we're talking about science, right? Science doesn't really tend to say a whole lot. It's the scientists, right, who say things and their findings and then the conclusions that they draw from them. And that's really no different than what we're dealing with here. So I'll do probably a separate piece on critical race theory. But I really wanted to address, just in something fairly short, right? I have trouble sometimes making things short, but in a very concise way, just to talk here about postmodernism. And of course, one of the most important aspects that postmodern thought addresses is the self, right? What is the self? And so, as I kind of got a little excited here with my highlighter, as you can see, right? He goes and talks, right? The first thing that the modern self commonly leads to social alienation or isolation or loneliness, because this self emphasizes separation. That's true, I do believe, right? So one of the things about postmodernism is it tends to have an observation, or you could say a mindset of separating things, right, into their disparate groups, right? And so he writes, right, the breaking of bonds to become independent and supposedly autonomous. And especially that last word, autonomy, it plays a big role in postmodern thought, right, being autonomous. Second, the modern self decomposes, right? That's really interesting, right? The modern self decomposes society into isolated individuals and destroys social solidarity, neighborhood, civic concern, and relationships of all kinds. Sure. Okay. I can't really disagree with that too much. And then third, this idea of the self simply fails to understand how we as selves or persons are created by our personal relationships, our culture, and our languages. And essentially, what he's saying here is that to a great degree, often postmodern thought thinks those things are really either superfluous, meaning like they don't have any importance, or even worse, it will be quite hostile, particularly that middle one, right? Culture, because culture is the great culmination of the past constantly inserting itself into the present, right? Another way to think of it is like tradition, right? And so, over and over and over, we constantly hear about, or rather, postmodernism constantly has this attitude of being antagonistic towards the past in its quest for autonomy, right? So it's, autonomy in postmodern thought. One important thing to remember is that it's not simply about being free to do with what one wants to do in the now and even hoping for the future, right? But to be particularly free of the past. And if I can find it, I took this really interesting screenshot the other day of this homosexual rapper who was doing an ad, right? It popped up in my Twitter feed for, I think, Logitech, who, I don't know, they make different types of tech accessories, right? And it was like, in order for us to, I don't know, pursue the future or whatever, right? We have to defy the logic of the past. And I was like, as disgusting as this whole thing is, it's actually, it's really emblematic of postmodern thought, right? So that autonomy, both in terms of movement, but also a sort of temporal autonomy, right? Free from the past, freeing oneself from time. And so Vitz goes on and he goes into some other important aspects about defining the postmodern self. And this, of course, relates to our conversation yesterday when we were talking about changes in the attitudes of Muslims, right? Forget about society, the greater non-Muslim society, of which Muslims are naturally a part of, right? Where do some of these attitudes and changes come from, right? So as we see here, the first part that I underlined, this is really critical. This is critical to postmodern thought, postmodernism as an interpretive method, right, of how we interpret meaning, particularly texts. And so we will see how this has indeed come to have a huge impact on modern Muslim thought. So as I underline here, right, Vitz writes, this postmodern mentality is characterized by a rejection of universal truth and objectivity and by a rejection of systematic binding morality. Wow, thank you, Dr. Vitz. That is an extremely apt description of not simply postmodern thought, right, or postmodernism, right? That is a lot of what's going on right now with people, right? How did we arrive, at this moment that we're in of craziness where every day there's an assault on, children, wanting to have them perform surgery on themselves, or, to reassign their genitalia, or to inject them with, all kinds of chemicals to do damage to their, hormonal endocrine system. How did we get here, right? We got here because of the rejection of any, there's no system of thought. There's simply only how our bodies react in terms of feeling, right, through our senses, right? So it's only what we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, and what we hear, right? That's the only thing that's binding. So there can be no binding morality. There is no objectivity for anything. And there is absolutely no universal truth, right? So he says, in other words, for the postmodern, both truth and morality are true or good only for the individual, or only as they interact with my senses, only with how they interact with my emotions, right? So if I gain joy from as a man, having a sexual experience with another man, then that's the only truth that can be determined based upon how it might feel, right? And if it feels good, at least at that moment, then I will indulge it. Matter of fact, I might even have an imperative, right, to indulge it. He continues, we have all run into this phenomenon. People say, that's okay for you. That is your truth. This is mine. And it's true. We do hear these, I don't really use this word woke. It's kind of become overused now, right? But these kind of woke-isms, right? Or these new age-isms of, I'm living my own truth, or go live your own truth, or live your best life, all this other nonsense that we hear. However nonsensical it may be, right? It is rooted. It is rooted in something, and it does come from a place. It comes right from this, right? This particular strand of postmodernity, Vitz says, right, has been traced back to Friedrich Nietzsche and the notion that, as Dostoevsky wrote, right, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. And of course, this echoes the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that said, what of the sort of like primordial, primeval truths that have come down throughout the centuries from the very first prophets, of which they told people, if you have no shame, then do whatever you want, right? If you have no shame, and of course shame being rooted to God, shame being rooted to Allah, that He sees you, knows what you do, then everything, then do as you want, everything becomes permissible, right? And so the postmodern also rejects all large theories, right? And this is interesting because a lot of people talk about Marxism and CRT and socialism. However, a real postmodernist would actually reject all large theories. And so that's where I feel like I had mentioned in the conversation yesterday, I feel that some of the people who are talking about postmodernism haven't really read it, right? And that it's become more of a buzzword, and they will use it sometimes interchangeably between Marxism and socialism and this ism and that ism, and it's like, man, I don't know if that's exactly true, right? Perhaps there is some Venn diagram type of overlap, but let's try to keep them as separate as much as possible, right? So he says that it rejects all large theories, and of course, one of the most obvious and glaring of large theories are going to be religious theories about the nature of existence, about the world, about life, and so on, right? So there are few larger theories than theological or religious ones, and so he writes, of course, Christianity. And it's true. I would say that actually postmodernism in particular, because it comes out of the Christian tradition historically, right, seems to have a bigger axe to grind with Christianity than perhaps any other religion, right? But it definitely has an axe to grind with all religions, right? And so he said it also rejects all grand narratives, right? So when we talk about, yesterday, men being men and men taking responsibility and, certain aspects about manhood, right? There can be no grand narrative for manhood. And therefore, matter of fact, there can be no manhood, and now we can just have personhood, and we can have all this binary, non-binary, and all this other things that come. Why? Because there's no grand narrative, right? Not only is there no objective morality and systemic morality, but there is also equally, right, there's no grand narrative, right? So and this is why it's important to understand postmodernism as a means of literary criticism, which is another way to say literary interpretation, right? Or how to interpret texts, or indeed perhaps how to even interpret reality, right? As an interpretive device, right? If we do away with the grand narratives, if we do away with the universal truths, if we do away with all of those things, then you become the author of truth. Because whether it's a text or whether it's a philosophy, right, there can be no inherent truth in either of those. There can be no inherent truth in a text, right? And therefore, the author and authority, right, are banished from the text, and you then simply pour into the text whatever you wish or whatever you desire. And that's how we were saying that you have certain thinkers, Muslim or quasi-Muslim, as it relates to the issue of homosexuality, that, for instance, we'll say that it is permissible, even though clearly the verses speak to the opposite. But because the author is now irrelevant to the conversation, and it's only what you think of the text, not what the text is speaking to you, right? Getting rid of and rejecting these grand narratives, right? Then you just simply pour into it whatever you wish, right? Right. So he said it rejects all the grand narratives, all the big stories that are supposed to describe how we live or should live. And in particular, right, this aspect of description, right? That's what we have going on now with the, gender binary, non-binary, non-conforming, some new letter added to the alphabet of this ongoing clown show, right? And a lot of that has to do with description, right? People are rejecting and obliterating, right, descriptions of not only what are the contents of, say, man and woman when it comes to the human being, but they're going to obliterate the actual containers themselves. So even though Allah is the one that says that He has created al-dhakar wal-untha, that He has created us as man and woman, right? Again, that author of the text, irrelevant, right? I can do away with that as I wish now. He goes on saying, right, postmodernism also rejects the authority of the author with respect to understanding a text. This is why I really like his book, because within a page or so, he really does a fabulous job of laying out what is going on and why it's such a big deal, right? So postmodernism also rejects the authority of the author with respect to understanding a text. Indeed, it rejects the idea that a text has an author in an authoritative sense. I mean, this is funny. So you have, whether it's the Quran, the Bible, Webster's dictionary, it doesn't really matter, right? Okay, the book, we can presume beyond a reasonable doubt that the book didn't get there on its own, right? And yet, the fact that it's not getting there on its own, meaning that there is an author behind that book, is irrelevant, right? We reject that in the idea that the author is merely your Amazon delivery driver, right? All the author did was put the book on your doorstep. It left the package on your doorstep, but the author, right? How dare you, as an author of a book, have any sense of authoritative ownership or intent about the very text that you produced? Absolutely absurd. How dare you, right? So in some literary forms of postmodernism, he goes on to say, theorists criticize what they will call any privileged interpretation. Did you hear the P word, right? That's exactly, this word, this is what we're dealing with right now, right? So theorists criticize what they will call any privileged interpretation, any general interpretation, right? And so what are we left with? If there's no privileged or general, then there is no interpretation at all, right? Instead, they claim that the individual reader is free to determine the interpretation just as the individual reader determines, say, truth or goodness or beauty. Not only truth and the moral life, but also the meanings of the text are relativized. So, even though I'll stop here on this, for now, right? But notice how he does throw in one extra word down here that we often don't invoke enough today. And this is definitely attached to and coming out of what? The Enlightenment. But I wanted to leave this here, right? Maybe in the I don't know, what do you call it, show notes or whatever that YouTube lingo is. What I will try to do is just leave this little short PDF here for you to look at with all of my, I don't know, it looked like my daughter went in here and color coded everything. But I wanted to use this as a way to, now we can have at least some type of document that can help to lay out and describe for us kind of, when we are talking in invoking words like postmodern, liberal, so on and so on, right? That way we can kind of have a roadmap to, well, what is really behind the meanings of these? And then inshallah we can continue the conversation further. And I think if time allows, I will try to do something similar for critical race theory, for CRT, because unfortunately it has really devolved down into, just a bunch of buzzwords and just a bunch of hyperbole that isn't really getting anywhere and addressing it. So, Jazakumullahu khairan, Jazakumullahu khairan, the Mad Mamluks, for having me on yesterday. Inshallah, I hope that it was of some benefit and you found it interesting. And if there's more stuff like this that you're interested in, that you want to have talked about or investigated, perhaps even in a live session or something, where we can have a little combo or Q&A, inshallah, let me know. Wassalamu alaikum.